My name is Dana Haney, and I'm the director of the Criminal Justice Research Center and a professor here at OSU of Sociology. It is my pleasure to welcome you to CJRC's 2015 Excellence in Justice Seminar featuring Professor Todd Clare with comments by Professor Price Spratlin and Steve Van Dyne, the Bureau Chief of Research and Evaluation at Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. For those of you that are also joining us for the first time for this lecture, the Excellence in Justice Seminar is a symposium that was started as part of a partnership between CJRC and the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. Our idea is to combine the research power of CJRC with the policy expertise of what is now ODRC's Office of Offender Reentry to translate research into evidence-based best practices. With that as an introduction to the series, I would like to now turn and provide very brief introductions of our fantastic panel. I do emphasize brief because we simply do not have time to talk about all of their many accomplishments and do justice to any of them. Okay, Dr. Todd Clare is the provost of Rutgers University at Newark. Previous, he was the dean of the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers and distinguished professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He has authored 13 books and over 100 articles and book chapters. His most recent book is The Punishment Imperative, where he discusses the rise and fall of mass incarceration in America, and which serves as the basis of the lecture today. Dr. Clare's research has also focused on community justice, correctional classification, prediction methods in correctional programming, community-based correctional methods, intermediate sanctions, and sentencing policy. He is currently involved in studies of the criminological implications of place and the economics of justice reinvestment. Dr. Clare served as the president of the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and the Association of Doctoral Programs in Criminology and Criminal Justice. His work has been recognized through many awards, including those of the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, the Rockefeller School of Public Policy, the American Probation and Parole Association, the American Correctional Association, and the International Community Corrections Association. He was also the founding editor of the journal Criminology and Public Policy, published by the American Society of Criminology. We are very honored and excited today that Todd can join us to continue his dialogue with this very important work. So thank you for coming. Okay, in addition to Todd, we are very pleased that Professor Townsend Price Spratlin can join us. He is an associate professor here at OSU in sociology. His research focuses on faith, social justice, and community capacity building in urban settings. His historical research assesses how organizations shape the 20th century urbanization of African Americans. His contemporary research explores how former felons are organizing with others to improve health and quality of life outcomes. Professor Price Spratlin is the author of 2 books, the forthcoming Nurturing Sanctuary, Community Capacity Building in African American Churches, and Reconstructing Rage, Transformative Reentry in the Era of Mass Incarceration. Welcome, Townsend. Townsend is joined by Steve Van Dyne, the research chief at the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. DRC manages Ohio's prisons, parole system, some county probation services, and jail standards. It also finances many community programs. Steve has supervised research support activities, including population cost impact of legislation at DRC for over 35 years. He also worked with Ohio's Sentencing Commission in a population-neutral revision of Ohio's criminal code. Previous, Steve was at the Academy for Contemporary Problems studying the incapacitation of violent offenders. He co-authored the book Restraining the Wicked with John Conrad and Simon Denitz and has written several articles. In 2012, Steve received the Peter P. Lidgens Research Award from the American Correctional Association. Welcome, Steve. During this lecture, Professor Clare is going to speak for about 30 minutes, followed by a very brief discussion and comments from Professor Price Spratlin and Steve Van Dyne. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So once again, thanks for joining us.
So I'm really delighted to be here. I had all kinds of things I was going to say about Ohio State, as introductions. They were all going to be really cute, and people were going to laugh, but I decided not to say any of them. I grew up in Indiana, across the border, and Ohio State was the enemy for people in Indiana. So it's good to be in enemy territory. Ironically, I've seen so many friends that I feel like maybe I'm sort of in a place where I belong, because I have all these contacts, and from going back to graduate school and before. So I'm really glad to be here. I hope to talk about what I think is really a watershed moment in the American justice system around punishment, particularly around prisons. The talk is a kind of an amalgamation of the last 2 books that I wrote. There's stuff from each of those 2 books in here, and I hope an opening for a book I'm working on now. But really, this is I was just saying to somebody, we will be looking back at this time period in American history from a penological point of view, and we will say everything changed. What we can't say now is what it changed to. So the story that we are producing right now, but the end of that story is not very clear to us. So I hope to maybe talk a little bit about what I think we can do in this room to try to produce the end of the story that we want. And I'll just preface that by making a point. If in 1972 I had said to you, over the next 40 years, we're going to quintuple the size of the prison system, actually a 6-fold increase. I don't know what sextuple is a word. A 6-fold increase in the size of the prison system. What do you think? You'd have said, there's just no way that we can pay for that. That's just not going to happen. I said, well, just imagine anyway. What do you think? And you'd have said, well, crime will go way down. And you know what? We have afforded it, because little by little over the 40 years, we just kept making this investment. And ironically, the crime rate today is about what it was in 1972. And that's the one thing you wouldn't have said. So the challenge I would say today is that even though it's easy to get caught up in contemporary thinking, really what we need to do right now is think about the future we're trying to produce and be focused in a laser-like way on what we want to see happen with the penal system that we so dislike. No one likes today's prison system. Nobody. Not the left, not the right. Today's New York Times front page story is the Koch brothers getting in prison reform. So I think it could be more scary. Grover Nordquist spoke to the community justice group, the restorative justice group in San Diego last November. I mean, the point is that something's going on right now, and it's very important, and we need to use it as a mechanism to get work done that is overdue. So, what is the great prison experiment? It has been a systematic and monotonic growth in the rate and size of imprisonment for nearly 40 years, starting in 1972. The last year that the prison population dropped in the United States until now was 1971. In 1972, there were 200,000 prisoners and a rate of about 100 per 100,000. Today, there are, in 2012, when the growth capped, there were 1.6 million prisoners and a rate of over 500 per 100,000. So a 500% growth in the rate and an 8-fold increase in the number of people in prison. That doesn't count jails, by the way, and that doesn't count other institutions people go. So how'd this happen? I'll come back to this, what I call the iron law of prison populations. I think it's the most important point I will make today. The iron law of prison populations is that prison populations are produced by the number of people who go there and how long they stay. I'm just going to say that again. They're not produced by recidivism rates. They're not produced by a lack of correctional programs. They're not produced by, policing, beating up young black men. Those are all things that deserve our attention. But if you're concerned about the size of the prison population, you're concerned about 2 numbers: how many people go there and how long they stay, and everything else is noise. There's a lot of noise right now in this business. Now, how many people go to prison is partly produced by how rapidly they return to prison. And so we get a lot of conversation these days about recidivism rates, about recycling, about returning to prison. I'm going to make an argument that I think that conversation is overstated. The importance of that statistic is overstated, but it is one of the ways that we get people going to prison. So this is a graph of the crime and prison, the crime rate and the prison incarceration rates 1931 to 2010. The red line is the incarceration rate, the blue line is the crime rate. And what this shows, I think, is some very important points. Now, the first thing I'll say to you is that if you're really interested in making a point about the relationship between crime and incarceration, it's up there. Whatever point you want to make, it's right there. You want to say, you know, prison and growth ends crime, do that part. You want to say prison growth travels with crime, do that part. You want to say there's no relationship between prison growth and crime, do that part. There's a 10 or 15-year period up there that will help you make any point you want to make about the relationship between crime rates and incarceration rates. So there's been a lot of research now on this. And by the way, there's not really one prison policy in America. There's 51 prison policies in America. And so the research, as the research has become more sophisticated, the answers have become more complicated. That's what we do. We're scholars. That's what we do to the world. But what's really interesting here is that the growth in imprisonment started after this multi-year increase in crime rates. And the first portion of it corresponded to an increase in crime rates. The second portion of it, of course, when it really accelerated, corresponded to a stability, rough stability in crime rates. And now that it is leveling off, we're having this big drop in crime rates. Now, conservatives look at that and say, see, you grow the prison system, you get crime rates to finally go down, thank God, right? And so there's problematic data in that. But the point is that when you want to say we grew prisons because crime rate was growing, actually, almost all of the growth in the crime rate occurred before we started growing the prisons. So whatever cherished idea you have about the broad scale relationship between crime rates and incarceration rates, it's probably not exactly true. We've had that graph shows 3 periods of broad prison expansion. In the 1970s, the growth in incarceration was primarily the growth in the number of people entering prison due to increases in crime rates, due to changes in crime rates. By the way, the rate of catching people for a crime, given that a crime occurs, the apprehension rate is roughly stable across that entire period. So that we're not better at solving crimes and catching people. I'll talk about what's really changed there. In the 1980s and to the mid-1990s, most of the growth was due to sentencing reform, mostly related to increasing the likelihood of people going to prison, a little bit to length of stay. And then from 1990s to 2000 to the third, it's almost all length of stay. So we have 3 major periods of growth. Growth because the system was growing, crime was growing. Growth then because we put more people in prison given a conviction of a crime, and then growth in length of stay. Remember my iron law, how many people go and how long they stay? So period 2 was how many people go, and period 3 was how long they stay. And in 2010, the crime rate was about what it was in 1972, the point I made here. Here's the graph of prison admissions. The blue line is prison population. The blue line is admissions, and the red line is prison population. What you can see is that prison admissions have been going down for, this goes to 2012, have been going down for 4 years. That trend continues. Prison admissions continue to go down to 2014, the most recent data, with a very modest impact on prison populations. And why is that true? Because at the same time we were reducing the number of people going to prison, we were increasing their length of stay. So 2 people going to prison staying a year translates into the same population of 1 person staying at 2 years, right? So if you're increasing length of stay, you don't get any benefits of reducing intake. Here's what's happened with length of stay. In 1990, people convicted of violent crimes served a median. By the way, length of stay is one of those things. It sounds like it's an easy thing to do, but it really is actually not a number that we find it easy to calculate, because we have so many people who are serving life sentences, and we don't know how long they stay until they die. So we really need demographers to be able to do this kind of work. People convicted of violent crimes serve with an average of 44 months, property crimes 21 months, drug crimes 19 months. In 2009, you can see that we increased all 3 of those length of stay. So we added 16 months to the average length of stay for people convicted of violent crimes, 6 months to property crimes, and 7 months to drug crimes. here's the change. What's interesting is that you know we are enjoying it less. What actually happened is that sentencing is interesting. In 1993, the median sentence length was 48 months. In 2009, it was 36 months. We were actually reducing what the judge was doing was actually reduced over that time period, but the time served was increasing. We eliminated parole. We eliminated a lot of the good time. And we had a high rate of people returning to prison on original charges due to technical violations when they were first released in the community. So actual time served increased even though judges were reducing their sentence. Parole time also increased, and parole is like making you eligible for being caught doing things that the rest of us never get in trouble for. So this combination of increases in time helped to produce this. So the total state time increased by more than a year, even though judges were imposing more lenient sentences. That has produced a change in the mix of the prison population. In 1980, 60% of the people in prison were there for a violent crime, 30% for property, 6% for drugs. Remember that 6% for drugs? Most of the drug law reform occurred after the 80s. By 1993, the proportion of violent offenders was lower. The proportion of property offenders were lower, mostly because the proportion of drug offenders in a prison system had grown enormously. They, by the way, go through the prison system at rapid rates, very rapid rates. So many of them serve less than a year. By 2005, that's what had happened. Because what happened in the 1990s was we increased length of stay for people convicted of violent crimes, so you got a larger mix of people convicted of violent crimes. So one of the things you cannot do to solve mass incarceration is to say we're going to let all of the first-time property offenders out, because that won't get you very much. Because that 19% includes a lot of people with long criminal histories, right? So what's happening in the decline in the prison population that's happening now? By the way, I didn't show you that since 2012, every year has seen a decrease in one portion of the prison population or both, either in jail or prison or both. So that we have a net reduction in the number of people behind bars of about 6% in the United States since 2012. First of all, the most important has been declining crime rates, which has been going on for more than a decade. There's also been decelerating political pressure. So we've not had a presidential election in which crime was an issue since Clinton. I bet you anything, the mayor, I don't know anything about the politics of Columbus, but I bet anything the current mayor of Columbus didn't run on a Get Tough on Crime platform. I bet you anything, right? The mayor of Philadelphia, a city with significant violent crime, is a former prosecutor and did not run on a Get Tough on Crime platform. Crime has not been the top, public safety has not been the top 3 or top 6 of any of the concerns of citizens in the what bothers you indices that we always do for a decade. So, you know, it used to be that you could get elected by being tough on crime. You had to out-tough your opponent, and I think there's a lot of residual belief that that's true. And I can tell you that politicians are nervous about this. But the truth is, crime has not elected anybody for more than a decade on to any level of I remember one time when I moved to Florida State, I was driving through southern Georgia on an election day, and there were people running for county clerk, and their advertisements where they would get tough on crime. Now, county clerks have nothing to do with crime, you know, but that's not true anymore, right? So, what are the issues? The issues are the economy. The issues are schools. The issues are infrastructure, inequality, and so on. There's also the cost of incarceration. I think this is an important but not a central issue. People overdo it, in my opinion. Much less attention is paid to collateral consequences of incarceration. I think they're much more important because I think they're felt across communities, and I think they're a source of enormous national shame that we all collectively feel. And then, of course, there's growing empirical evidence about prison and crime. Every new study comes out with a smaller estimate of the impact as you get more detailed in the data you gather. So when Ed Zedlewski's research showing that every person you lock up prevents 500 crimes, that article was sent out by the federal government. I got it 4 times in the mail, by the way. It was sent out to everybody. Every study since then has estimated a smaller impact, and the current estimates are much, much smaller. As the statistics get more sophisticated and the data points get larger, the estimates of the relationship between crime and incarceration get smaller. So, so I now need to really get to the next thing here. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the collateral consequences, because I think they are actually the place where the greatest amount of energy is being built for this. So we know that that incarceration concentrates itself. It's not uniformly spread across the landscape. It concentrates gender and age. 90% of the prisoners are men. Over 700,000 people go to prison each year. They enter in the average on the age of 20, at the average on the age of 29, and they exit on the average at the age of 32. Imagine what men 29 to 32 are supposed to be doing in their communities, and these are all things that are not done in those communities by those men. Over 1 million children have a parent behind bars. These statistics are actually old. I just saw new data on each of these numbers, and the numbers are actually significantly larger. Obviously, this concentration is also by race. Black men are 7 times more likely to go to prison than white men. Women are 8 times more likely, and the rate of growth of drop of incarceration rates for men is much higher than for women. So the mix in the prison system is growing for women. Women are a higher proportion now. They're not yet 10%, but they're a higher proportion now than they used to be 10 years ago. 12% of all black men aged 20 to 40 are behind bars. That's 1 in 8 black men behind bars today as we speak, of that age group. At current rates, 1/3 of all black men will go to prison, and blacks are 10 times more likely to be in prison than to be in a labor union or on welfare. Those are all data from Bruce Western's wonderful book. Also important that incarceration rates concentrate by place. I can tell you that, and you know this, that there are Columbus neighborhoods that have lots of people going in and out of prison. There just are. I can tell you, I don't know anything about Columbus except that we hate Columbus because we're from Indiana. But that's supposed to be funny. But there are neighborhoods in Columbus where some huge percentage of the young men are currently locked up. And you know that, and I know that, and that's because that's what incarceration does. In Cleveland and Baltimore, there are neighborhoods where 18% of the adult males are behind bars on any given day. The black neighborhoods in Brooklyn, the incarceration rate is 12.4%. In the white neighborhoods, it's 2.7%, the daily incarceration rate of men. In Chicago, half the prisoners enter 7 neighborhoods. Tallahassee, which I'll talk about a little bit more, the research in the first book in this series, there were in 2 neighborhoods. So we started thinking about incarceration rates at the neighborhood level back in the mid-90s, and we did research in a Frenchtown neighborhood. I'll show you a map of it in a minute. And in our interview schedule, we went to churches and said we want to talk to people. We sat in restaurants, and the people walked in. We were not from there. We were white people in a black neighborhood sitting in a restaurant. And they would look at us and we would say, "Hi, we're from New York. We'd like to talk to you," and blah, blah, blah. And so we did all these things, neighborhood presidents and so on. We ended up talking to neighborhood association presidents. We ended up talking to several hundred people from these 2 neighborhoods. And on our interview schedule was the question, has somebody in your family been incarcerated in the Florida prison system in the last 5 years? 100% of the people we talked to said yes. Not 100, everybody. Including the former mayor of the city of Tallahassee, including the president of the Urban League, and including the reverend of the largest church in that neighborhood. If you're black in Tallahassee, you have a family member in the prison system if you live in these neighborhoods. So this is a map of Delray Beach. This is another thing we know. Crime concentrates. This is a classic crime map. The blue is where crimes occurred. So there's a hot spot up in the northeast. This is I forget the name of that. So who knows Delray Beach here? What the avenue is there? Atlantic Avenue. And so you can see there's a handful of crime rates. What that translates in is to arrest rates. This is juvenile arrest rates by block. The brown section of Delray Beach is called the Atlantic neighborhood of Delray Beach, and it produces 90% of the criminal justice activity in the city of Delray Beach. So Delray Beach doesn't have a crime problem. These places have a crime problem. Delray Beach doesn't produce people in the justice system. This neighborhood produces people in the justice system. This is largely Afro-Caribbean here. and this is Hispanic up here. This is a Brooklyn map, jail and prison admissions. You can't see that this is sort of small block units. You can't see it, but the largest neighborhoods send up to the largest neighborhood, the dark brown, of which there's a lot concentrated in those areas there, have a minimum of 20 people per block, per that block area going to prison, and a maximum of 275 people going to prison from that place in a year. 275 people going to prison from that place in a year. There's some activity down here, but most of the white sections of Brooklyn have almost nothing going on. I'll come back to that map in a minute. So how can it be then that incarceration and crime are related in this complicated way? I'm going to make an argument that incarceration has become a part of the crime problem, not a solution to the crime problem. I'm pushing time a little bit, so I'm gonna whip through this. Ordinarily, because we're all scholars, I do a lot of theory stuff, and I really actually don't like theory very much. So let me. I'm sorry, Ruth.
Skip that part.
We'll just skip that part. So there's some reasons why this stuff might work the way it works, and you'll probably want to talk about this. But we've done a lot of empirical studies of collateral impacts. This is just, I'm not going to put anything up here, but this is just a list of something for the book that came out in 2007 on imprisoning neighborhoods. Of the studies of the negative impact on children, that's the first group, there's about 10 of them. Families, there's about 9 of them there. Parenting, there's 3 studies there. Community level, there's 1 study. Health, there's 2 studies. This was in 2007. There's a lot more now. So we already knew by 2007 that the growth in prison system had been having negative consequences. This is the sort of the literature review summary for the chapter called Death by 1,000 Little Cuts. None of these effects is very big, but they're additive, right? And so if you are a kid growing up in a neighborhood with a high incarceration rate, you have an added impact of your likelihood of ending up in the juvenile justice system, added impact of your likelihood of being a child in a house where the parents are separated, added impact of living in a house that has reduced economic means, added up all across, you have, and all little effects all added up together. This is a map of Tallahassee. The dots are crimes, the shaded areas are incarceration rates for those neighborhoods. We wanted to ask ourselves the question, what's the relationship between incarceration rates and crime rates? And this is what it was. So that if you're in a Tallahassee neighborhood, what you find is as your incarceration rate goes up, the crime rate goes down till you reach a tipping point. And then the incarceration rate starts to go, as the incarceration rate increases past that point, the crime rate goes up. So if you live in a high incarceration rate neighborhood, this is the removals effect, the effect of removing people to put them in prison. There's a return effect, right? There's an effect of people coming back from prison, and it's not curvilinear, it's a linear positive effect. So if you live in a neighborhood that has a lot of people going in and out of prison, you get the effect. You get reduced safety on the basis of the removals, and reduced safety on the basis of the returns. This is Frenchtown. When I taught at Florida State, my office was right about here. I'm going to do a little mental experiment there with this map. This is about 2,000 residents. Frenchtown's the oldest African American community in Leon County. It's the only place where black people were allowed to buy houses after emancipation. There's 50 dots up there. That's the number of prison returns from prison. A number of prison admissions in that year. Now, you can't get admitted to prison. You can't return from prison unless you get admitted. So there have been roughly 50 returns. This is release locations. So you can't go to prison unless you can't be released from prison unless you go there. So there's 50 dots there. So 50 people were removed from there, right? So I want to do this visual experiment for just a second with me. So imagine, look at those dots, and then just in your mind, double them. And that's 1 year's activity. And then take that mental picture you've just done and double it again. And that's 2 years of activity. And then take that mental picture again and double it again. And you're looking at the amount of criminal justice activity in a neighborhood for a person who goes to high school. a young person who goes to high school. And there's just no place in that neighborhood where you're not being affected by the criminal justice system during your developmental years in high school, right, if you're a young person. If we did interviews in here, the most important issue people brought to us was how many young people are going into the criminal justice system, not crime. Crime was an issue, but incarceration was the issue. And they said to us, and I can tell you that this was almost uniformly also said, this wouldn't be allowed to happen in a white community. So they totally get it. This is back Brooklyn again. This is sentencing ratios. The blue areas are ratios of people going to prison for men aged 20 to 40. So what you'll see is that in some areas the ratio is 8 to 1. There's one person going to prison every year in that neighborhood for every 8 males of that age. And you know what? The entire work of the criminal justice system is to try to get that ratio to 1 to 7 or 1 to 6. Wow, we had a success. We caught more people. We sent more people to prison. As though that's somehow what we should be doing. These are expenditures. This is the one that everybody likes. This is Eric Kaddour's map. This is the $1 million block argument. There are about 25 brown blocks up there where at least $1 million was spent incarcerating people that year from that block. So if I went to that block, I could just tell you this. If I went to the block, if we were going to spend $1 million here, what would you like to do? They would have something to do with that money. And they would. This is the idea of community justice reinvestment came from a conversation I was having in a church in Newark, New Jersey, back in the 90s. I was giving a talk in the evening. I just happened to hear that morning of the number of people from that neighborhood who were sitting in reception in the New Jersey State Prison, going through the reception diagnostic process before they went to the general population. I think it was 20 or 15 or some number. I did the math. I estimated what the costs were, and I went to that, and I did this as a throwaway line. I said, you know, young men from this neighborhood were about to spend $15 million, and I forget what the number is, $15 million on them. Would you like to have that money? And they thought I'd get some head nodding and stuff. I started getting applause. You know, we're willing to spend tons of money on these neighborhoods, tons, but not in the neighborhoods. So what that is, I mean, this is a bit of a stretch, but not too much of a stretch. That's money from people who live on Park Avenue being given to people who live in Auburn, New York, to watch people who used to live in Brooklyn for a couple of years and send them back worse. That's the deal that represents. We have plenty of money to spend on crime. Infrastructure, social problems in those places. We're just not willing to spend it on crime, social structure, infrastructure, social problems in those places. So today's debate is changing, and this is where we are right now. There's a lot more, much more nuanced conversation about the impact of incarceration on crime. You used to, I mean, some of you are too young to know this, but it used to be almost impossible to get a conversation about anything other than if you lock them up, the place gets safer. But you don't hear much of that. You sometimes hear it, but you don't hear that much about that anymore. The studies from the 80s and the 90s showed fairly significant effects, but the most recent studies have shown much smaller effects. And in fact, this has led to a conversation about the big incarceration experiment, which can be analyzed as a kind of a big social experiment, which is what the most recent book does. There's also a debate about collateral consequences of incarceration. We now know that there has been enormous inequality produced by this, particularly around race, and a handful of books exploring that, really important books exploring that, on people who go to prison, but more importantly, on people who do not go to prison but live in the communities producing all those people going to prison. And finally, there has begun to be an emerging conversation on how do we reduce prison populations. But I don't think the how do we reduce mass incarceration conversation has become very mature yet. Because although in state reforms there's a lot going on, 1/3 of the states have closed or proposed to close a prison. Those are the states. Notably, Ohio is missing. 2/3 of the states have enacted criminal justice reforms designed to reduce prison populations. There's Ohio. But most of the conversation about reducing mass incarceration has been distracted by side conversations that have no impact. For example, there are emotional topics like innocence. There are plenty of innocent people in prison, but if every one of them went out tomorrow, everyone who's innocent of the crime they're serving there went out tomorrow, you would have essentially the same incarceration rate. You would have more justice. It's a good thing to do, but it isn't about mass incarceration. And by the way, if every guilty person had to go to prison, I would be talking to a group of 3. The death penalty. I'm opposed to the death penalty. I think it's wrong, immoral, but it is not related to mass incarceration. We talk about a lot of programs. For example, reentry. My favorite. I love the reentry movement. I think it's been a very important part of the change in the attitude and the mood of people. And George Bush, whatever he did to us, he gave us reentry as a concept, and thank him for that. However, it has nothing to do with mass incarceration, nothing. Because you can't reenter until you've gone to prison, right? And if you want a lot of good reentry, then you want a lot of good going to prison. Alternatives to incarceration. There's never really been much impact of alternatives to incarceration. I made my early career on the basis of this, and I can tell you that it has not had much impact on incarceration rates. And you can do anything you want to probation, and you're not going to do anything at all about prison. Now, I believe in alternatives. I believe in good probation. We should make investments there. It is far more humane, but it's not how you deal with mass incarceration. There's a lot of talk about rehabilitation programs. We are morally, ethically, and empirically bound to make rehabilitation opportunities available to people who are in prison. And doing anything else is wrong, but it will not solve the problem of mass incarceration or have much impact. You simply can't have that size of the effects, because remember the iron law of prison populations. Prison populations are produced by how many people go there and how long they stay, and none of those items has much impact on either of those 2 variables. Just to illustrate, if you really reduce the length of stay to the level, this is a national data that Jim Austin and I have worked on. If you reduce length of stay for sentenced prisoners to the 1988 levels, diverted technical parole and probation violators from prison. In other words, you said if you break a rule while you're under supervision, but it's not a law, you can't go back to prison. Eliminate mandatory penalties for drug crime. In other words, if you're convicted of drug crime, you can't go to prison. And reduce length of stay for people placed on probation parole. You cut the amount of time people are vulnerable to the system in half. You get 1980s prison population in 5 years. It's that simple. U.S. prison so in conclusion, I would say that the U.S. prison population growth between 1972 and 2010 was an unprecedented policy experiment, and the results are in. The evidence has accumulated that the impact on crime has been very small. The collateral consequences have been unthinkable and not sustainable, and the fiscal implications are not desirable. We are in a completely different policy environment today, and we need to take advantage of that policy environment. We are entering a period of time in which prison population reduction is going to be the main conversation in the policy arena. And how do we move that conversation away from distracting topics toward the topics that will actually make a difference? Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, I think I'll be okay. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, cool. Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Dana, for the opportunity. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Really appreciate the engagement of ideas. I'll be very brief. Couple thoughts. 3 points of appreciation and 2 points of concern related to the punishment imperative. Point of appreciation. 1, you scholarly engage the contradiction of ignoring the 1967 Presidential Crime Commission report's focus on contexts of prevention through reduced inequalities, to just 6 years later, the Rockefeller laws, 4 years later, President Nixon defines drugs as public enemy number 1. 6 years later, Rockefeller institutes Rockefeller laws, and the race and primary spark and motive for this punishment imperative is given its juice. I appreciate your scholarly engagement with that particular contradiction, that period, that historical period, and its dangers within the book. Two, you use the phrase on page 45, and I just want to engage folks. I don't know how this will go, but I just want to engage folks in the idea. On page 45, you say, our addiction to incarceration is relentless. Our addiction to incarceration is relentless. And if we think about addiction, and addiction is handled in a variety of ways, from a treatment perspective, the addiction is understood through the lens of complete and total abstinence. So from a societal standpoint, as we're engaging narrative with those various data and statistics, how do we understand the narrative of addiction as metaphor, informed by data, toward complete and total abstinence? What might that mean societally and institutionally? I just shared with you. So our addiction to incarceration is relentless. Now, there's also a strategy of relating to addictions reduction called harm reduction, which is what the mass of the bulk of this work addresses and actually engages in. There's a dialogue between those two things, but I think it should be. I think there's worth in it being informed by a systematic engagement of the metaphor. And I appreciate your representation of it. Three, you end the book by focusing on the punishment imperative's conclusion being understood as a community development agenda, not a service delivery agenda. And if it's understood through a community development agenda, then you're returning to the core of what the 1967 Crime Commission's report's point actually was: systematic community empowerment to reduce inequalities informed by and in partnership with the Johnson version of the Great Society, this Great Society program. Not a war on a substance, not even a war on crime, but engagement and movement toward a broader sense of societal equity, and with strategies of action to follow. So I appreciate the engagement with those ideas. 2 points of concern. Concern one is the near complete absence of former felons in this engagement. Now, a part of the challenge is I realize that you're intending the book's contribution to be different from and supplemental to what you did in imprisoning communities, where there was a meaningful presence and resonance of certainly the family members of former felons and other community residents. So, but that change to me it would be helpful to bridge that dialogue to engage the punishment imperatives and its conclusions with the voices and lived experiences of, as you did systematically in imprisoning communities. So that's a point of concern since I value the voices of current and former felons. Concern number 2 is the present and pending menace, in my view, of private prisons. Now, realize 20% of the state system, 8% of the federal system, excuse me, reverse, 20% of the federal system, 8% of the state system, so I realize it's a small percentage, but private prisons, especially in a state like this, where Victoria's Secret uses prison labor, and Victoria's Secret's owner has a relationship with this institution, where our governor has direct ties to CCA, one of the 2 primary private prison companies, has direct ties of past employment and friendship affiliation. We are living in a state of contradiction, and in which one of the prisons of the state was sold outright to CCA. The Lake Erie Correctional Facility. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, and other state people, but that's the reality of the weight of $73 million, as I understand it. So, private prisons are a concern, and it's not engaged within the context of the present punishment imperative. And if the punishment imperative is coming to an end, then this society's engagement with the profitability of black and brown bodies has a complicated history, and there is great worth in exploring the meanings of private prisons to that. While the chapter focuses on the objectives of the punishment imperative of black and brown bodies, for-profit was not considered in detail. While the link to a period of indefensible wealth concentrations was made, the racializations associated with it, the limited consideration of privatization was surprising. Okay, and just a point of closure. Being presented with the details of a grand social experiment, a grand social experiment's abject failure, in my view, placing it in the context of a vital 1967 Presidential Commission report that was virtually ignored, and ending with a concept of 7 principles that can be turned into measurable action steps of institutional and societal transformation are among the book's many contributions. I look forward to the next steps of dialogue and other actions this morning and beyond toward a more excellent justice. Thank you.
At 50 cents of this material, that should come close to being enough for
I
everybody.
just want to say Steve Van Dyne brings data. Are we surprised?
And there are some graphics on there on time served. If any of you are eagerly aggressive, interested in the numbers behind those graphics, there's some extra sheets there. Okay. I've known Todd, first communicated with him almost 40 years ago. Great scholar, great person, even a great person with solid research and a righteous cause deserves a solid critique every now and then. I get to do that. Okay. Understated in the presentation today, but significantly stated in his book, is that a lot of the growth of the punishment imperative came from political maneuverings, using increased punishment as a wedge issue. I've sat in on lots of discussions in that regard. That almost certainly is true. He didn't talk much about that. It's a fairly important point. His suggestion is that drove a lot of the increase. Now, I'm suggesting that data offers other solutions to at least explaining a significant part of the increase in prison populations. If you look at I'm suggesting first that there are 2 penal experiments, and the first one was a massive failure and probably helped to generate the second experiment. It's the sheet that's got 2 charts on top of each other. One is the Ohio incarceration rate per 100,000, 1960 to 2013. Bloomstein and Cohen had a classic article on incarceration rates, said that most jurisdictions over a 50-year period had rates that ranged between 100 and 120 per 100,000 population. Ohio fit right into that in 1960, 117.9. However, over the course of the next 14 years, Ohio's rate dropped to 71.7. Now, there is some correlation, skip that. You might understand it going down if crime had been going down. Crime had not been going down. Crime, using uniform crime reports, increased almost 3-fold during that period of time. And the likelihood of committing a violent crime, the ratio of committing a violent crime to the number of people walking into a prison dropped precipitously from 45% to 13%. Now, if you wanna, I am not among those who argue that there needs to be a major deterrence viewpoint on this, but you can't ignore the kind of impact of a shrinking prison population when crime is going up massively. My suggestion is that that represents a penal experiment that failed and generated much of the seeds of the punishment increase that came on after that. Okay, second aspect, length of sentence. Ohio did have a major length of sentence increase. It occurred in 1982, with Senate Bill 199. Why would we have a major increase in sentences? Yes, there is the punishment imperative, but if you look at the graphic of several different felony levels and the time served, you'll see that in 1982, the average sentence for felony 1, that's aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, voluntary manslaughter, this is the time served for those kinds of people, was 3.1 years. For low-level property offenses, it was about 1.5 years, maybe 1.25 years. Very little difference between those two. In response to that, and that was very significantly influenced by our parole board letting lots of people out. In response to that, the legislature came back and massively increased, especially for repeat offenders, sentence lengths, or the possible sentence lengths. And you can see what happened after 1982 and 1983 as they all go up for years. Right after that, I moved from the APA level to the department level. One of my first assignments was figure out the impact of that bill that they just passed. My bottom line estimate after two months of using adding machines to do all this thing was 1993, we should have 43,000 prisoners. We had 14,000 at that point in time. That one bill generated almost all of our increase over the next 30 years. Since then, there have been very few things that occurred that fit into the punishment imperative concept, partly because we've had a research unit that tested out these proposals, fed that information back to the legislature and to our administration, and Ohio is a cheap state. We didn't have any, no longer did the department have to go down and say this is a bad idea. Instead, we went down and said, well, this will generate 2,000 more inmates. If you want to pass it, go ahead, just make sure you give us an extra $100 million every year so that we can handle this extra prison. It has been remarkably effective at deflecting many of the major increases that occurred over that period of time. Now, there's one other explanation for why some of these population increase patterns takes place. It needs to be addressed, very rarely discussed in the literature on the growth of the prison population. If you look at the model on the back of the sheets, what I've got here is two different models that are virtually identical. They both start with 40,000 people being sentenced. 80% of them are nonviolent, 20% of them are violent. The likelihood of going to prison for each of those categories is the same. The only thing that changes is the proportion of the nonviolent offender population who have longer term or longer records. Judges do not sentence nonviolent prisoners or drug offenders to prison usually first time they come before the court and get a felony offense. They usually don't do it for the second time. Especially in the rural counties, by the time you show up in front of the judge the third time or the fourth time, they're tired of you. You are, using the politer ways of saying it, an irritant in the side of law enforcement in this court. So they send them to prison. If you look at the growth in crime in some different periods, you can see that that would lead several years later, especially for new people entering the system, several years later to begin to come in front of the courts with longer records. It is at that point that the prison population begins to grow. So looking at these situations have to do with the composition of the offender populations, and adding that into the analysis will demonstrate that a lot of the growth has taken place as a consequence of that changing composition of the offender population. I'll stop.
Yeah, so a couple of things. think that, I want to say the point, years ago I wrote a paper about the punishment, the addiction, the prison addiction. And I took, there in 12-step programs, there's 12 questions that you answer to see if you're an alcoholic. And one of the questions, for example, have you ever wanted to drink less and you couldn't stop? You know, and in the entire 1990s, we wanted to send more, we wanted to reduce the number of people going to prison, and they kept going up. Another one is, have something really important to you ever had to be, you couldn't do it because you were you were inebriated? And how many times have we wanted to fix schools, or add to healthcare, or fix roads, and we didn't have the money, because in the local areas, the jails always were the first places to get their budget. And everything else came in after the jails got their budget. So, and I did this whole 12-step thing. I never published the paper. It was fun to write, and it made the case basically that this addiction metaphor from the addiction literature fits us very well. We can't stop doing it. So that's one of the reasons I use that. I think the thing about voice is actually really important. In this next book that I'm working on now, I'm going to try to bring voice back in, because I do think that without that, it gets dry. Argument gets dry. A couple of things. We were talking last night at dinner. This little thing down here that shows people doing under a year. This is a graph. It's easy to look like a graph like this and think that that's numbers of people. That's what, 41% of your intake serves less than a year. So these little things down here are just lots of people, which is one of the reasons why the kinds of arguments you often hear, first-time property offenders, let's get them out of prison, don't do anything to the mass incarceration problem, because I mean, you multiply those across numbers, it's still a lot of years, but you have to go down to 0 for all those to start having much impact on the overall population. Whereas if these big numbers up here are small numbers of people. So there's this problem that the prison population is composed of, and we were talking about last night, different sets, and you have to think about mass incarceration from the point of view of that if you're trying to reduce the number of people behind bars. And I think this is exactly the kind of analysis that has done. Mike Jacobson has made the point in some of the talks he's doing. He's also working on a book in which he says, you know, if you got 1.6 million people in prison now, and you want to reduce it to say 500,000, you're going to have to do something about people who are serving time for violence. You just have to, because the numbers aren't there to do it all on drugs and crime. So we have to have the right conversation, right? If we really, the metaphor, I apologize, and you told me that somebody else has used a similar metaphor. If you went to a doctor and said, "Doctor, I just found out I have cancer. What should I do?" And the doctor said, "Well, we have treatments for cancer, and they work pretty well. And in your kind of cancer, they're 80% effective, but they're painful. You know, you're gonna experience a lot of pain. Your hair's gonna fall out. You're gonna feel sick a lot. You're gonna miss work. It's gonna really affect your life. So, all things being considered, why don't you just take some aspirin instead?" You'd say, "You're fired, doctor." But that's what we're saying about mass incarceration. We know what the answer is. It's painful. You know, we have to change policies that made us feel better, but are not giving us the result we want. You know, so this is the conversation that has to happen now. And it really is a difficult one. What do we do about people who are convicted of violent crimes? How do we imagine it? How do we imagine a system that responds to them? What do we do with people who commit 5 crimes in a row in a 10-year period, 5 serious crimes? What do we do about, you know, a large number of people who are processing through the system for drugs, crimes-related drugs? And these are conversations we have to start now, or we will look back at this time period and say, hey, we missed an opportunity. There was no more a left and a right on crime policy. It went away. There was no more, you know, the fiscal conservatives and the liberals. Everybody was aligned to say, we have too many people locked up. How do we get them out?